Come now to the third event in the biblical book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar's statue and the fiery furnace. And most of us know about this story of these three young Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refusing to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's idol and miraculously being saved from the fiery furnace. This event contains timeless lessons about the persecution of God's people since time began. I mean, if you understand the issues brought up in Daniel chapter 3, you'll understand pretty much every issue facing the church today and for times to come. This was not just about Nebuchadnezzar's statue. This is the old age battle between humanism versus Christ. So we read in the text about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, refusing to bow down to the statue. But where's Daniel? That's often a question that comes up in regard to this text. We don't know. Any argument is an argument from silence. Well, maybe Daniel found some way to avoid the situation. But there's a lesson here, even in Daniel's absence, such as not all Christians experience the same trials. God in his sovereignty has some Christians born in countries that are very oppressive. And then God in his sovereignty has us born here in America where we have religious freedom. And we can each glorify God in a different way. Also, we see later that Daniel was thrown into lion's den, but where are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? So again, we have different trials at different times of our life. Also, when persecution comes, some Christians can find ways to avoid the confrontation. Like Paul in Acts chapter 9, when he was let down the city wall in the basket by night in order to escape persecution. Before we even get to the place of persecution and martyrdom, God calls us to avoid it. It's not heroism to put ourselves into dangerous situations where the world is demanding of us that we violate the word of God. I think about that situation where my son was offered a six-figure job in the city working for a fashion business that was known for its LGBTQ environment. He didn't take that job because he didn't want to put himself in that situation because he eventually knew he'd be required to support that agenda. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, whenever they persecute you in one city, what are you supposed to do? Flee to the next. Jesus did not say you have to stay in that city and endure the persecution. In fact, by moving around, that actually helps us get the gospel out throughout the entire world. The kind of persecution described here in Daniel chapter 3 only comes when God does not provide a way of escape. Now let's look at the statue itself. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and the width 6 cubits. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. It was made of gold. Of course, it was not solid. It was covered in gold leaf, which would make it an awesome sight glistening in the sun. And notice the image in the ceremony was made even more intimidating and awe-inspiring by the power of the music. Remember, these ancient people didn't have CDs and MP3s, and most never heard music like this before. And I found it humorous that the instruments in this band are repeated continually. Look at verse 5. The moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipes, and all kind of music. Daniel 3:7. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipes, and all kind of music. Daniel chapter 3, verse 10. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipes. Then verse 15. Now, if you're all ready, the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, and the bagpipes, and all kind of music. So why are the details of this band constantly repeated? Probably because the writer wanted to emphasize that this music was very special and very powerful. If you've ever been to a concert, you know how the power of music can get the crowd going. The dimensions of the image, verse 1, show that it was kind of like an obelisk, 90 feet high, anywhere between 9 and 15 feet wide, the height of a 8-story building. For perspective, the Statue of Liberty is 150 feet high. And with those dimensions, it was more like a spire, more like the Washington Monument. This is a picture of the Luxor obelisk in Paris, which was taken from an Egyptian temple, the Temple of Ramses II. It's 75 feet high. The image was set up on the plain of Dura. Dura was a common name for any open field. So the point is that many people could assemble around it. The whole city could come out. What was the image? Well, we don't find out what it is any place in the text. It could have been something that symbolized the empire. It could have been one of the gods of the Babylonians, Marduk or Bel. However, in chapter 3, verse 12, the officials make a separation between the image Nebuchadnezzar sets up and the gods of the Babylonians. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 14, the beast, in the future, the empire, and the Antichrist also set up an image and demand that everyone worship the image of the beast. We really don't know what that image will be, but it's something that represents the empire of man. And what's fascinating is that the Antichrist requires the same worship of an image as did Nebuchadnezzar, as did the Caesars of Rome in the first century. Satan, who's the god of this world, and his people want some sort of physical demonstration of allegiance to humanism. To be able to identify, to separate out, to persecute those who are on God's side. So don't underestimate the agenda of this world. There's all sorts of persecution going on today, very similar to what we read in Daniel chapter 3. Well, given that chapter 3, verse 1 comes right on the heels of the dream of a statue mentioned in chapter 2, there is good reason to assume that the statue Nebuchadnezzar built was the statue he saw in his dream. Daniel chapter 2, verse 31, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a great statue, which is large and of extraordinary splendor, and was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome." And Daniel even told Nebuchadnezzar that he was the head of gold, that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. Daniel 2:38. So maybe Nebuchadnezzar had this great idea of building a physical representation of what he dreamed. After all, this dream was from the spiritual realm. And there's a lesson here in the fact that Nebuchadnezzar is having a dream of the future world empires. Daniel interprets the dream and tells him that in the end, the empires are going to be destroyed by God, who's going to set up a kingdom, right? Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, "In those days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all of these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever." But instead of seeing the sovereignty of God and the authority of God in this revelation, Nebuchadnezzar sees it as a reason to build a statue and worship the empire of man. The whole point of the vision in chapter 2 was to show that God was to be worshiped, but in chapter 3, man is being worshiped. And Nebuchadnezzar's actions really remind us of those people who hear the word of God, but they just don't get it. As Jesus said, they have ears, but they don't hear. They have a heart, but it doesn't understand. Even people today take the word of God and use it to worship themselves. Like the Pharisee and the tax collector, he used religion to feed his own ego. So we may not know exactly what the image looked like, but we know that it represented what all idolatry ultimately represents: the worship of man, the worship of man's authority. And it goes under many different symbols and images, but the issue is still the same. Are we to worship man or God? Are we to obey man or God? Is man the center of the universe, or is God the center of the universe? Is morality a function of our own opinions and feelings, or is it a function of God's decrees? So the citizens of Babylon were required to give this image worship, and hence worship the empire of Babylon, worship the state. Each of the four empires described in chapter 2, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, have demanded allegiance in defiance of God. Because in secularism, in the ways of this world, the state takes the place of God. The state has the authority of God. The state becomes God. Because the state is the combined power of man. And since we've all evolved into being these great human beings, we consider ourselves God. Practically, the state wanted worship for unity. In order to maintain power, you can't have competing local deities, competing ideologies, competing cultures. The state wanted uniformity for the sake of power. Remember, at the Tower of Babel, God broke up that uniformity. Second, the state wanted authority. Nebuchadnezzar, in having everyone bow down before this image, was demanding a public display, recognition, submission to his absolute authority. So Nebuchadnezzar's image had both political and religious significance. The state was to be these people's religion. And for a lot of people today, their religion is the state. Now, the greatest threat to an all-powerful state is what? The greatest threat to the rule of man is that there is a God, that there is a truth above the state, that the state is to be under God. The state is not to be God. And that's why the state, an ungodly humanist, will persecute the people of God, because they want to be the final authority. And it's not just politicians who are fighting for this exclusive power. The average citizen is also at enmity with God. Every man wants to throw God off the throne and put himself on the throne. So this week's YouTube, some of my teaching happened to coincide with this morning's message. And my YouTube this week was about the cancel culture. The story of these, three Jewish young men in Daniel 3 is a great example of how to stand for truth and how standing for truth undermines the cancel culture. In the YouTube, I asked the question, why was Nebuchadnezzar so angry? The rage of Nebuchadnezzar is pointed out in this text because Nebuchadnezzar could not afford to have three young Jewish boys refuse to bow down. Because then people would begin to think the state is not God and the state doesn't have to be obeyed. Notice Nebuchadnezzar's response. Chapter 3, verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He wasn't happy. Then Nebuchadnezzar interviews them, and they say to the king, we don't even have to think about this. We are not going to fall down before your statue. Our God will deliver us, but even if he doesn't deliver us, let it be known to you, O king, we're not going to serve your gods or worship your golden image. Then in chapter 3, verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated, because Nebuchadnezzar himself was 7 times hotter. And this will be the response of the world when you defy their humanism. These social leaders probably don't even realize why they're so angry. But they despise their authority being threatened. It's all about their personal power, their unwillingness to submit to God's truth. And I explained in YouTube this week that lies are more fragile than truth. So that truth is not so greatly threatened by lies, but lies are threatened by any truth. The lie cannot even have one small child stand up and say that the king has no clothing, because then everyone would see the obvious. So that's why in communistic, totalitarian states, they have to employ millions of thought police. Because the biggest threat to an ungodly state is this idea that there is a moral truth from God that's above them in their opinions. They lose power if there's a truth above them. A moral truth above them undermines their false narrative that gives them power. So this is why, again, the world will persecute Christians who stand for truth, because Christians stand in the way of the false reality that they're pushing on the world. And at the end of this age, this is what it all comes down to. This is what everyone's going to worship. Man on the throne, humanism. Revelation 13, the world is worshiping the image of the empire. The mark of the beast is called the number of man. Why? Because it's man himself that's being worshiped. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Antichrist sets himself up as God. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will, the apostasy or the day of the Lord will not come unless the apostasy comes first. The man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Daniel chapter 3 is the status quo in every century, but it foreshadows the future of man's rule on earth. So if you understand this, you understand everything that's happening in the world today, or everything that will happen. Don't get lost in all the minutia. Understand the core issue that's driving the world today. And understand that coming to Christ means stepping down off of the throne of your own heart and putting Jesus on the throne. So now let's just look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their situation. Chapter 3, verse 12. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Now, the picture we might have in our minds is of these three men standing while everyone else on the entire plain falls to their knees, which would be an awesome picture and lesson. The peer pressure to conform would be enormous, which is often the way it really happens in real life. And the fact that only three were standing while everyone else is bowing down is just a great reminder of how few people stand for truth. When push comes to shove, most people just go along with the crowd. Even in our popular culture, those people who say they're nonconformists, you know what? They're conformists. And it's here we have to remember Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and the way is broad that leads to destruction. And there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small. The way is narrow that leads to life. And there are few who find it. Because there are few who stand for Jesus Christ and confess him before men. And I hope you're part of that few. Now, verse 12 seems to indicate that their failure to bow down was not immediately noticed by all. It had to be pointed out to the king by certain Chaldeans. Verse 8, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. For all we know, these young men may not have even shown up for this ceremony, which could have been a likely scenario. But notice that others are quick to accuse. Others have a judgmental spirit and want to see other people thrown in the fire. They have a certain man-centered worldview and expect others to have the same. They may have been operating on jealousness, jealousness, is that a word? They may have been operating on jealousy or vindictiveness. If I have to do it, you have to do it also. Some people are about making other people conform to give themselves a false sense of control or fairness. So let's just be prepared for this reaction from the world because it's coming. Remember what Jesus said? Brother will betray brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You'll be hated by all because of my name, but it's the one who endures to the end who will be saved. Matthew 24:10. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another, just like we see this betrayal in Daniel chapter 3. Now, one point I made in YouTube, I want to repeat this, is we ought to understand the subtlety and deception of this whole thing. I mean, we read this text and it seems so cut and dry. I mean, if you bow down to the statue, you're of the devil and you're on your way to hell. If you stand, you're for God and you're on your way to heaven. But we know in real life, the situation is often not so clear. And the devil includes many deceptions. Every persecution of the church has always been in the name of public health, safety, patriotism. The state usually doesn't come out and say, we hate God and we want to stop Christians. Persecution always comes with an excuse, a rationale, a claim to social justice and righteousness. Satan and the world, they don't just persecute, they mess with your head. Maybe that's just a way to say it. So standing for the truth always means being able to see through some very powerful and deceptive lies. The issues at stake are not very clear to most people, because when you take a stand, there's always going to be people telling you that you are falling on the sword for the wrong issue. The issue is not what you think it is. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, your refusal to get down on your knee is just arrogance. And we can be sure there are some people who said, what's the matter with you? You bunch of religious guys. You don't want to worship the emperor as God. But I'm sure there are other Chaldeans who said, hey, we're not really worshiping the emperor. This is just patriotism. This is just like saluting to the flag. All we're doing is showing our faithfulness and loyalty to the king. Isn't that biblical? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're just so deluded, so proud, you're out of touch with reality, you're just making up your own narrative. It's not what you think it means. See, that's the way persecution really happens. It's not so clear-cut. The excuses for going along with the world sound so legitimate. Remember 2 Corinthians 11, false teachers will appear as angels of light. And when the prophesied Antichrist arrives, Revelation 13, he's going to require that people take the mark of the beast to buy and to sell. And you can be sure there are many people who are going to say, well, this is just like a Social Security number. It's no big deal. This is just like a credit card. What's your problem? You're starving yourself and your family for something that's not so important. It may mean evil to you, but it doesn't mean evil to me. But then the Bible tells us this very surprising and sobering statement. If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives the mark on his forehead or on his hand, he will also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. So those Christians who thought the mark of the beast was evil, or will be evil, they're right. And you better know what you're doing when you take a knee before the world. So notice also the example of faith here. Their confidence, their boldness, their sacrifice. Daniel chapter 3, verse 16, we don't even have to give you an answer concerning this matter. Do we have the same faith to stand for Jesus Christ and his truth? Are we willing to sacrifice our jobs, our homes, our very lives? Have we made up our mind about this matter so we don't even have to think about it when it comes? Or do we still need to think about it? Now, notice their answer seems to be a paradox here. In one statement, they say, not only is God able to deliver us, but he will deliver us from your hand. But then they say, even if he doesn't deliver us out of your hand, well, which is it? It was faith that God would deliver them, but at the same time, it was also resignation to the will of God as to when deliverance will come. God will deliver us. He will resurrect his people, but not as the world measures time. Every Christian martyr burned at the stake was delivered, right? But not in the deliverance the world could see. Notice the faith of these young men was commended in the great chapter of faith, Hebrews 11, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, putting foreign armies to flight. Their great faith was rewarded. That's the whole point of Hebrews chapter 11. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. For by it men of old gained approval. We gain approval of God by our faith. Because without faith, it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is the rewarder of those who seek him. Now, the miracle here is quite amazing. The furnace was upright. It had a large door to insert crucibles. Most commentators agree that the furnace was located near the statue, which would make an impression on the audience. You better go along with Nebuchadnezzar's wishes because there's a big furnace over here. From a physics point of view, how does God suspend the law of nature and separate the heat from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Chapter 3, verse 27, the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw, in regard to these men, that the fire had no effect on their bodies, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. How does that happen? Could it be some sort of force field? Could it be some sort of twisting of time and space? It's a real reminder that nothing's impossible for God. If God could supernaturally protect his people from this fire, what's your problem that God can't solve? What are your fears that God can't protect you from? This deliverance represents more than the deliverance of these young people. It represents God's deliverance for his people throughout the centuries. 100 years earlier, God promised to deliver his people through the fire. This great text in Isaiah 43, but now thus saith the Lord, your creator, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by my name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, nor will the flame burn you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. Now, we take that more metaphorically, but it actually happened physically. We are invincible until our work on earth is done. But notice what happened to the soldiers. These valiant warriors mentioned in verse 20. Their job was to throw victims into the fire. The heat, the lack of oxygen overcame them. They passed out and were probably left on the platform to die. Daniel 3:22, for this reason, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You feel sorry for these soldiers? I take from this part of the story that if you don't serve God, you'll just be a second-string actor in the story. You know those characters who are supposed to die? You become an example of a wasted life. You become one of the red shirts on the old Star Trek episodes. Do you know that Trekkies have actually figured out the percentage of dying if you're wearing a red shirt in the old Star Trek episodes? Because all the main characters wore blue shirts, and all of the extras who are just going to die from the monster or whatever on that particular episode would all wear red shirts because they were not main actors. They weren't that important. So I guess if you're in a dressing room and they throw you a red shirt, you know that that's going to be your last day on the job. This is kind of the meaning of Isaiah 43:4. Since you're precious in my sight, since you're honored and I love you, I will give other men in your place and other people in exchange for your life. This is not to be cruel to those people who don't know the Lord, but it's to emphasize the special status we have as part of the family of God. Nebuchadnezzar sees a fourth person in the fire. And this is definitely a lesson that God is with us, protecting us. Nebuchadnezzar calls him one of the sons of the gods. He's interpreting the scene through his own pagan understanding. But this human form, this fourth person, impressed Nebuchadnezzar. He knew that this person looked supernatural. Well, the chapter ends with Nebuchadnezzar changing his mind about his decree and his authority. This miracle, like the miracles in the days of Moses, the miracles of the prophets, and the miracles in the early New Testament church, all were given to God, all were given by God to reestablish God's authority in the world, to restore a fear of the Lord in the hearts of people. And that would last for a few generations. I mean, look at how this miracle changed the culture of Babylon. Daniel chapter 3, verse 29, therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no God who is able to deliver in this way. And the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. So God's authority is reestablished in the world. God's people are protected. And within a few years after this, the empire of Babylon actually collapses. And it's taken over by the Persian Empire. And the collapse of the Babylonian Empire was actually a good thing, because the empires of man always result in more pain and suffering. And so, in a very real sense, the stand that these young Jewish men took for God and the ensuing miracle undermined the whole ideology and the whole foundation of Babylon. This was more than just saving these three followers of God. This was an ideological destruction of Babylon itself, the world. This idea that man is in charge, that law and authority belong to man, that glory belongs to man. That was all undermined. But look how much difference is made when God's people stand up for God and refuse to conform to this world. Maybe that's the takeaway we should take. Revelation chapter 12, verse 11, and they overcame him, the Antichrist, because of the blood of the Lamb, and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives, even when faced with death.